I want to make sense today of the theory and the history of capitalism in the web of life, specifically in relation to the class dynamics of energy and the politics swirling about resources today. First of all, we know that alternatives are not going to displace fossil fuels, even as the world hits peak fossil fuel consumption very fast. This is a first warning sign that we should be alert to arguments that foreground substances like stop oil and so forth. The problem is not fossil fuel, as we can see here, despite the dramatic increases in renewable energy use, there is an even more dramatic increase in CO2 output. This from NOAA, the U.S. Climate, Oceanic, and Atmospheric Agency. So I want to begin with a provocation: to blow up a pipeline and you could slow global warming for a day, shut down the relations of capital, class, and empire that made the pipeline, and you can stop it for good. Of course, not overnight. The problem is not substances. The problem is capital. Now, capital binds with and creates resources. That's an important point. It sounds obvious, but for most of the climate left today, they have embraced a substance fetishism. This is a problem. Theory matters. Theory on the real ground of history, of course, as Marx and Engels would say. From the standpoint of the proletariat, theory is always adjudicated on that real ground of history. Theory is, therefore, from this standpoint, a theoretical struggle, as Lenin reminds us, that is fundamental to socialist strategy in the climate crisis. That climate crisis is a class struggle in the web of life. Now, at the heart of Marxist theory of political economy is the circuit of capital. And the Marxists, not Marx, as we'll see, the Marxists have got it wrong. It's not important that you memorize this or you know everything. Here's the key point: that in these schemes, capitalists take a pile of money and they buy the commodities necessary to engage in commodity production and then exchange. In the one-sided version of this argument, which has been the overwhelmingly dominant account, I would say 99% of Marxist political economists have reduced the different categories of capital to fixed capital and to variable capital. Now, as we'll learn in just a moment, Marx's constant capital for Marx comprises of two moments: fixed capital, that is machinery, and circulating constant capital, which includes all the energy, all the raw materials that go through the circuit of capital. This moment has been disappeared, and it's been disappeared conceptually and theoretically and empirically over the past century of Marxist political economy, and it is reproduced today in the theory of so-called fossil capital. So the labor resource dialectic at the heart of Marx's thinking about constant capital has been erased. This is Andreas Malm's famous circuit of capital. This is where he drops into the frame a non-relational substance, whole, in order to explain and revise Marx's circuit of capital. Now, revising may or may not be a good idea, but to remove the labor resource essence, dialectical essence of resources, is something that Marxists have long called something like substance fetishism or vulgar fetishism. In fact, I could not find a diagram that would show these two moments of constant capital, of machinery, fixed capital, and circulating capital, the raw materials that are used up in a given production cycle. And so here you can see my annotation to the conventional view that it's just means of production, fixed capital, and labor power. Why does this matter? Well, it matters quite a bit, because if we have a non-class view of resource consumption, we have surrendered to the ideological orthodoxy of neoclassical economics, which is bourgeois ideology and class war in academic clothes. This has practical considerations as well that we can tease out in discussion. So all of you, perhaps, or many of you are familiar with Marx's famous culminating discussion at the end of his account of large-scale industry in Capital. That is, that large-scale industry proceeds by undermining the original sources of all wealth, the soil and the worker. He is not saying the soil over here and the worker over there. He is saying that the soil and the worker are dialectically and historically joined. If you will, there is a proletarian moment and a biotarian moment to class formation under capitalism, and that these dynamics are also relayed in mediated form through the circuit of capital. The circuit of capital is not economic as opposed to a class dynamic. The circuit of capital is a class dynamic that seeks to account for the socio-ecological antagonisms of the law of value under capitalism. So we are back here to the logic of capital in the web of life, which is irreducibly socio-ecological, both as an accumulation strategy and as a dynamic of class formation and class struggle. This was formulated by Marx in Volume 3 of Capital as the general law of underproduction. General law is his term, of course, in the Hegelian sense of a tendency that includes counter-tendencies. And this is crucial for understanding not just resources as irreducibly socio-ecological and class dynamics, but also the circuit of capital as a whole, as a class dynamic. Capital does not move around webs of life. It moves through and transforms webs of life in the accumulation of capital, in this specifically pathological and absurd logic of accumulating wealth and power that always relies on what I've called cheap nature, the sources of unpaid work outside the circuit of capital, but necessary to it. That includes human labor, the unpaid work of domestic labor, for instance, but also the unpaid work of all manner of extrahuman life, from coal seams to forests to soils. Crucially, in this account, Marx gives us a socio-ecological account of crisis that is at the heart, that is the absolutely central to his theory of capital and accumulation crisis, and therefore of class struggle in the web of life. So in this reckoning, Marx clarifies circulating constant capital is not the same as circulating capital in the way that it has come to be understood, that is, as money capital or finance capital. And that the more that capitalist dynamism proceeds, the more it must exhaust the underlying sources of all wealth, the soil and the worker. Understood, of course, metaphorically, not only the soil, but all manner of conditions of capitalist accumulation, subsequently developed by Jim O'Connor and the Second Contradiction in highly skeletal form. So in other words, we need a theory of accumulation crisis if we want to have a theory of class justice in the climate crisis. That is, if we want to confront the, as Professor DeMarchi just outlined, if we want to challenge the technocratic dictatorship of the sustainability of the rich and their climate emergency dialogues telling us to surrender everything in order just to survive, then we must have a theory of accumulation, and we must have a sense of how today's impasse, the accumulation crisis today, the crisis of democracy, the crisis of world order, is all implicated in the climate crisis, and the climate crisis is implicated in each of those. For those who are curious, you can go and read my many texts, including in Italian and many other languages besides English, that are on my website. So I won't walk through all of this because I would like to have a good amount of time for conversation. But here I think you get the point that the labor makes resources, and the class dynamic creates resources, not out of thin air, but of course always as a co-productive dynamic, a socio-ecological dynamic, which is also, at the heart of Marx's theory of capital, his labor theory of life, and his socio-ecological theory of class formation and class struggle. So these elements are spelled out quite explicitly in Marxist thought and have, I would say, been picked up very selectively by ecological Marxists and eco-socialists. There is a general reluctance on the part of these tendencies today to take Marx seriously on the class struggle in the web of life. What does he say? Well, with Marx and Engels in the German ideology, he says they say production is twofold. It is irreducibly socio-ecological, on the one hand social, on the other natural. It is also twofold in another sense. It joins production and socio-ecological reproduction, intergenerational procreation. This is all more or less from the first 30 or 40 pages of the German ideology. Labor is a specifically harnessed natural force. Marx writes in the Grundrisse. This appears throughout his work. He chastises the German socialists in the critique of the Gotha program for a labor theory of value, saying, no, indeed, we need a socio-ecological theory of value that nevertheless regards labor as the activating element. And that's another moment. Labor is activating. It is not a call, Marx's argument is not a call for a labor reductionism, but for the centrality, dialectical centrality of labor in activating socio-ecological relations. This is true at the core of their philosophical system. It is a labor ontology, a labor theory of life. As Engels summarizes, labor created man. But labor also activates in a sense that's deeply relevant to the fossil capital conversation, that labor class relations activate new potentialities slumbering within nature. That's from Capital, the first page of the chapter on the labor process. He also reminds us with Engels that cooperation is a force of production. This against the eco-modernist Marxist fantasy of somehow technical fixes can resolve the problems. And then finally, it's a critique of bourgeois Prometheanism and the bourgeois fantasies of the domination of nature. So labor activates. This is crucial to a revolutionary and socialist imagination of the climate crisis and the politics that will come out of it. I can't do this full history in this talk, but I will point out that major unfavorable moments of climate change, certainly since the Dark Ages cold period in the 5th century, have been linked to fundamental crises of political and economic power, from the crisis of the Roman West to the crisis of feudalism to the crisis of the 17th century that I'll touch upon, including the climate crisis of the so-called the Industrial Revolution. I will point out that the coal mining revolution, if we want to talk about fossil anything, does not begin in the 18th or 19th centuries. It begins much earlier. It begins in the era of primitive accumulation, what Marx calls the rosy dawn of capitalist production. This, in fact, virtually all of England's coal fields in the north are being worked by 1560. This is the moment, as I referenced through primitive accumulation, of a great proletarianization. It occurs during a moment of climate crisis that is partly capitalogenic, made by capital. This is not important that you go through the details here. This is simply an illustration drawn from Charles Tilley's famous study of the demographic origins of the European proletariat, that the share of the European population that is strategically reliant on cash wages grows from about a quarter of the population to about half between the years 1550 and 1700. That's also a moment of climate crisis that is partly driven by capitalogenic forcing, that is the slaving-induced genocides of the New World that reinforce other dynamics of volcanic activity, of a solar minimum, and a shift in the North Atlantic oscillation, the Gulf Stream, during the coldest period of the Little Ice Age. Now, the period of Malthus, of the Industrial Revolution, of the second slavery, not just in the United States, but in Cuba around coffee, or Cuba around sugar, rather, and Brazil around coffee. This occurs in this later moment. If we want to understand the key machine of the era of the so-called Industrial Revolution, it is not the steam engine. It is not fossil fuel. Those are enabled and activated by the institutional and technical revolutions of what Dale Talmage calls the second slavery, the invention and diffusion of the cotton gin and the appropriation of a specifically indigenous cultivated strain of cotton called hirsutum that was capable of withstanding the machine milling of the textile manufacturing centers. This was absolutely central. Marx says this in Theories of Surplus Value. He says it was only the fall in the price of cotton that allowed for large-scale industry to develop in the way that it did. This is true not only in terms of supplies of circulating constant capital, that is cheap cotton, but also in the capital formation of the so-called Industrial Revolution. It was not just the slave trade, as Eric Williams identified, but also the profits of the West Indian planters that provided the critical increment of capital formation for the so-called Industrial Revolution. Indeed, while everybody wants to talk about fossil capital, nobody wants to talk about cotton capital. We should ask why that is so. This is part of a larger set of arguments around cheap nature that I can do no more than underline here. Essentially, the argument is that capitalism is not a narrow economic system. It is not a narrow social system. That's part of it. But that these economic and social superstructures are dependent upon the politics of cheap nature, the politics of moving to new parts of the world, new frontiers, and appropriating through violence and law and power, appropriating through extra economic means, the conditions of capitalist profitability, above all, the four cheaps of labor, food, energy, and raw materials. This is a long-term cycle. This cycle is now gone, over. Put a fork in it. It is done. And this accounts for all manner of pathological symptoms and morbid symptoms, as our comrade Gramsci would tell us. So this is a theory and a history of the class struggle in the web of life under capitalism, in which cheap nature politically constitutes the crucial sources of capital accumulation and proceeds by constructing every profitable industrial, financial, and other architecture on the unpaid work energy of, as Maria Mies would say, women, nature, and colonies. The unpaid work of the proletariat and the biotariat and femitariat as central, not separate from, but central to the essence of the planetary proletariat and the ongoing dynamics of class struggle in the world. Cheap nature has two moments. One is to cheapen in price. The other, and again through political means, and the other is a dynamic of geocultural devaluation, to cheapen, to, in the English language sense of the term, to rob of dignity and respect the life and labor of the vast majority of humans and the rest of life with it. This is embedded in successive waves of the civilizing project, all the way from Columbus to President Truman's Point 4 developmentalism speech in 1949, to the Washington Consensus, and yes, to sustainable development as well. In each of these phases, there is a return to Malthus. It's not necessary to read this whole passage. This is from Malthus's second essay, published in 1803. And essentially, there is a continual cycle of Malthusianism that continues to run through ruling class ideology every time that it's threatened. In capitalism's epochal crisis, the signs of which first began to appear during the great popular and third world revolts of the 1960s and 70s, we saw the birth of modern environmentalism, as Joan Martinez Allier has called it, the environmentalism of the rich. So we want to understand that these calls for austerity, for climate emergency, for the surrender of democratic rights in the era of climate crisis come out of a long-standing ideology that's in moments of instability for capital, for the ruling classes. What do? They return to nature. Nature is the most dangerous word in the English language and in any Western European language. So transition. Well, what kind of transition and for who? For whom? Well, let's think about that. And here I'll just share a few concluding thoughts. First of all, capitalism is in the grips of an epochal crisis. It will not restore the conditions of profitability. And the orientation both of the camp of Beijing and the camp of Washington in very distinctive ways is towards what Samir Amin once called a tributary mode of production, or to a full-throated political accumulation model in which political and military power will secure the massive profit, in contrast to 5 centuries of capitalist strategy relying on cheap nature frontiers that aim to advance the rate of profit and therefore consequently the massive profit. So worldwide, there is a massive overaccumulation of capital. Overaccumulation is itself a symptom of the exhaustion of cheap nature. Centrally, it's political dynamics alongside those of geophysical contradictions. The climate crisis is not existential, but it is epochal. Even James Hansen, America's leading climate scientist, said a decade ago, his account of the Venus syndrome required all of the fossil fuel being dug up in a very, very short period of time for that to come even remotely into play, pardon me. Yes, fossil fuels are a moment of a larger problem, but we cannot reduce our politics to limiting, regulating, stopping fossil fuel use. They must be grounded in a broader project of popular democracy. The climate crisis is a crisis of capitalism, as I've argued for more than a decade. It cannot be solved within capitalism's business as usual. That's why we have a shift towards political accumulation. One thing that we are seeing definitely in the North Atlantic is a transition towards what I'm calling a new climate consensus. And this is embedded in all the institutions of the eco-industrial complex that have been in formation since the 1970s, the UN Environmental Program, green parties, government ministries, university research centers, and academic programs, and as always, the big foundations, the corporate foundations, historically, like the Rockefellers and Fords. Today, of course, the Gates Foundation is huge. Soros Foundation is very big as well. These all have converged towards a new climate consensus that seeks to balance the costs of climate adaptation and mitigation on the bottom 80%. It is a politics of planetary managerialism and good science in the emphatically sarcastic use of that phrase. The crisis is also signally and intimately related to the crisis of liberal democracy, which is not being terminated by the populist right, but by centrist liberal forces themselves in the interest of advancing a political accumulation model through the new climate consensus. Therefore, a just transition around climate must prioritize the radical extension of popular democracy. And crucially, people talk about decolonize this, decolonize that. Well, if we look at the history of decolonial moments, the second part of what I'm about to say is crucial. We must be willing to defend those efforts at extending popular democracy against the military intelligence tech alliance of the Washington Pentagon, Davos. I wrote Davis, but Davos axis. Finally, climate is not everything, but climate change is in everything about our politics today. Therefore, we must prioritize building solidarities around work and political power that allow for the effective democratization of the world, that push back against a new Malthusianism under the sign of the Anthropocene and state of emergency politics, including climate emergency politics. I'll end there so we have a little bit of time for discussion. Thank you very much.